has come to your home, you probably just saw that there is a recording going. This is a public event, so we will be sharing this later. So thank you, everybody. My name is Elsa Batras-Boni. I work for the Department of Neighborhoods, and I am very excited to be sharing with you today our session. So today's session goes from noon to 1:30, and if Diana can help me move the next slide, we can talk a little bit about what today it's going to be. In the I Love Census Data, it's a series that brings together community members, city agencies, and staff, and of course, data professionals and community artists, and to basically make interactive and good presentations about what data is available and what can we learn about data. So our hope is that you will learn about city facts and statistics, and more importantly, to talk about what all the census and all data is telling us about our city and making it available and accessible to our communities. But before we move on, we would like to acknowledge and recognize that we are on Indigenous land and the territorial and current territories of the Duwamish people. So let's take a second to reflect on that. Our next slide will tell us, thank you for that. Our next slide, it's our basic agenda for today. Like I said, we're going to go from noon to 1:30, and we have a great topic today. And what I'm excited about is our great group of panelists, powerful women who are going to be talking to us today about, oh, let's just move back to the one today about the topic for today. So I will be telling you a little bit about what has happened since the 2020 census data. What happened, if you all remember last year, it happened. And so where is the data? So I'll talk to you a little bit about that. Then we'll have a conversation about where does this data come from? Where are the data from today's conversation, and also from the census and others comes from. And then we'll have our panelists, and we'll have time for questions and answers, and we'll wrap it up at 1:30. So let's move on to the next slide. And I can tell you what has happened since the 2020 census data. And we love to call this data. Do you mind, Diana, going back to the, yeah, thank you.
Yep.
We wanted to call this session I Love Census Data to make it accessible. And my thing that I always say is that data, like love, is complicated, and it's not always straightforward. And this is a way in which we can bring data information to community in a space to have a conversation, but also question and clarify, and especially keep us accountable for the work that we all do. So as you know, last year was the decennial census. It was a big deal. It's a big deal for data in the country and the nation, and actually many different nations do it every 10 years at the same time. And last year, unprecedented as anything with COVID, it was supposed to go from April to July, and it got extended till October. And that was thanks to a lot of advocacy and work from communities. And so one of the greatest things is that Seattle got one of the highest rates of participation in the nation, which was 76.3%. That's a huge number under the circumstances where we were. This last April, we got a only the first results was the amount of people that are in the US. That was the basic number we got this last April. And that's right there. There's many million people. And then we are expecting the actual data that is going to be released with details of neighborhood, more specific data in August, late August. And we are excited for that. And for that, we will be bringing you more information. So I just want to give you some, there's some questions in the chat. When was the cutoff for 2020 census? It was October of 2020. That's when everything got cut down, and then the Census Bureau started counting. And as you know, it was a very challenging time, and we made it, and now we are going to have to be very vigilant about the data that we receive in the next month. I want to introduce you to a fantastic group of presenters. Our panelists today are from 2 different departments at the City of Seattle. The Office of Planning and Community Development, we have Diana Canzoneri, who is our city demographer. We have our fantastic Ubax Gardheere, our Equitable Development Initiative Director, also from OPCD, the Office of Planning and Community Development. And we also have 2 Power Women presenters from the Office of Housing, Jessica San Clemente Gomez, Strategic Advisor on Housing Policy and Equitable Development. And we also have Stephanie Velasco, who is a Communications and External Relations Manager for the Office of Housing. I will be talking a little bit more about them, but wanted to make sure that we all know who the people are for today's presentation. That's Ubax, a picture of her. Then we'll have Diana. And with that, I'm going to leave you in great hands by introducing you to our city demographer, Diana Canzoneri, who has been our demographer for 12 years. She works in the Office of Planning and Community Development, as I said. She provides analysis to inform neighborhood planning, long-range planning, and growth management, and development of housing. Diana is going to be talking to us about 2 different things, and we're going to start with where does the data we're going to be talking about today comes from, the difference between the census and the where does this data come from in general, and then we're going to move on to the topic for today, which is displacement. What do we know about displacement in the city of Seattle? What we don't know, what data can tell us, and what are the tools that the city has right now for you to use for referral, for information, and for your knowledge. So please welcome Diana. Thank you for being here. Are you ready, Diana? You ready?
I am ready. I just need to go through these slides. Okay, there we are.
Go ahead.
All right. So in these sessions, I always start with some basic information about the decennial census and the American Community Survey, which is the other major Census Bureau program that tells about people and households in local communities. So the decennial census is done by the US Census Bureau to provide a full count of the US population, reapportion seats in the US House of Representatives, and provide data for drawing new legislative districts, including local boundaries. The census questionnaire goes out to all households and group quarters like dorms and nursing homes and gathers basic information on demographics and housing. The American Community Survey, which we call the ACS for short, is a continuous sample-based survey that produces estimates on a whole variety of population, social, economic, and housing characteristics. Each household has about a 1 in 500 chance of being selected within a month. And the Census Bureau packages up the data collected from these estimates, packages up these data and releases the ACS estimates annually. Also, to provide more reliable estimates and allow for reporting for neighborhoods, the Bureau also publishes pooled estimates that gather up 5 years worth of ACS data. One more note is that before 2010, most of the ACS topics were on a long form version of the questionnaire that a sample of households got at the same time the decennial census was done. This slide lists a bunch of the topics, actually not all of them, but a bunch of the topics in the ACS and highlights the smaller set of demographic and housing topics that the decennial census includes. And we can use this data to see how neighborhoods are changing in their basic demographics and racial makeup. And with the American Community Survey, we can see a lot more. But first, I would like to show you some of the information that we have about neighborhood change in and around Seattle. The three maps on this slide look at areas in and around Seattle based on decennial census data for 1990, 2000, and 2010. And each map shows the percentages of neighborhood residents who are people of color. So as we can see, and this is not a surprise, we can see that the share of population who are people of color grew much more rapidly outside of Seattle in places like Renton, Kent, and Auburn than in Seattle itself. The maps on this slide give a close-up view of the changes that have occurred in broadly defined neighborhoods within Seattle. The map on the left shows changes between 1990 and 2010 using census data, while the map on the right shows changes between the 2010 census and some more recent ACS 5-year data. Blue areas show where people of color increased as a percentage share of the population. Orange shows where people of color decreased as a share of the population. And the downward triangles show where the population of color decreased, not only in terms of the share of neighborhood population, but also decreased in absolute numbers. So one of the things that we can see is that the patterns of change have actually shifted a fair amount between the period from 1990 to 2010 to the more recent period. One of the things that happened is the decreases in the population of color proportion have expanded from being concentrated in the central district to including a larger swath of neighborhoods. All right. On to some definitions. Gentrification is a form of neighborhood change in which the characteristics of a neighborhood shift as more affluent and otherwise advantaged households move in. This can happen with increased investment in previously disinvested neighborhoods and is also commonly accompanied by increasing home values and rents. Displacement, as narrowly defined, is when existing residents move from their current residence, even though they don't want to do that. Because I'm presenting on census data, I'm focusing on residents, but it's important to acknowledge that displacement of community-based organizations, businesses, and cultural anchors are also super important to combat. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about how gentrification is typically identified. So analysts trying to figure out if a neighborhood has gentrified look first at the beginning of the study period to see if the neighborhoods are, quote, eligible, unquote, to gentrify. Typically, they consider a neighborhood eligible to gentrify if it's less affluent than the broader metro area. For example, if the neighborhood has lower income levels and lower home values or rents. And then, if a neighborhood was eligible to gentrify, the researchers look to see if it actually underwent gentrification. So, for example, they look, compared to the metro area again, has the neighborhood had more than average increases in incomes or home values and rents? And studies sometimes also look at the share of residents who have a 4-year college degree or who are in professional or managerial occupations, who are white, and then sometimes there are also other things that they look at. Many of the topics in the ACS, income, education, rents, home values, et cetera, are exactly the kind of topics that we want to look at when we try to identify gentrification. Accordingly, the Urban Institute's Guide to Measuring Neighborhood Change, which I have linked to in this slide, talks a lot about the ACS. And I recommend this as a resource, both for the tips that it provides in using the ACS, as well as the other ideas and sources it suggests. It's a great resource. In any case, a really big caveat is that using different criteria for identifying gentrification can lead to some very different conclusions. So here are the results of 3 different methods, all use census data to identify tracts that gentrified in the 1990s. This is actually from a widget that Enterprise Community Partners has on their website. It's called the Gentrification Comparison Tool. And you can use it to look at different decades in addition to the 1990s. Okay, I need to mention some of the limitations that exist in the readily available decennial census and ACS data. Importantly, these programs are not designed for longitudinal analyses. So generally, all we can see are net changes. We can't use these data to separate out changes due to people moving in, people moving out, or even like people staying in place, but changing, for example, aging or increasing their earnings. Also, data about people experiencing homelessness is super limited in the decennial census and also especially in the ACS, and we can't tell when people become homeless. There's also nothing about the reasons why people actually moved. So obviously, one of the things that we very much want to understand is what's the relationship between gentrification and displacement? Does gentrification lead to displacement? It's complicated. It's complicated to study. Typically, in order to do this, researchers need non-public data to see if low-income households are actually moving out of gentrifying neighborhoods. For example, some researchers use longitudinally linked ACS data that's non-public, while others use things like Medicaid patient records or credit bureau data sources. And in many cases, even these special data sources don't indicate why people moved. I want to refer you to a really good literature review that Miriam Zook from the Urban Displacement Project at UC Berkeley did, along with her co-authors. There's a link to it down at the bottom of this slide. And by the way, we will send out all of the slides so you'll have access to them and the links in them. So Miriam Zook and her co-authors identified some consistent findings in research about gentrifying neighborhoods. For example, outmovers are more likely to be renters, more likely to be poorer and people of color than in-movers. And also rent appreciation predicts displacement. But she also described some other less consistent findings. For example, displacement can precede gentrification. For example, when property owners sense that a neighborhood may be getting hot and they increase their rent in order to get households to move out, or they do other things like remodel and then raise the rent to get people to move. And at least one study found that poor households in gentrifying neighborhoods are less likely to move than poor households residing elsewhere. So there are a lot of complicated things, and displacement dynamics can vary depending on the type of city that you're talking about and a lot of other things. Another thing that sometimes doesn't get picked up is people are moving frequently, but it may be that a low-income household with increasing rents, wants to, try to keep staying in a gentrified area because the neighborhood is increasing in terms of the amenities that are available and so forth. But at some point, they just can't bear the housing costs anymore and they have to move. So, it's kind of like chance in terms of whether the study periods are actually picking up those moves by households. So that's something that's, among other things, important to keep in mind. I want to highlight this one study that was done more recently by researchers at the Philadelphia Federal Reserve and the University of Chicago. They completed it in 2019. They actually got approval from the Census Bureau for using a non-public data set that links ACS data, decennial census, and administrative data across individuals and across time periods. It's a really cool data set, but you have to make a proposal and get special permission from the Census Bureau to access it. So this study found Seattle to actually be the third most gentrifying city in all 100 metro areas analyzed in the country. And that was after Washington, D.C., which was first, and Portland second. Overall, while the study found that gentrification slightly increased the rate at which less educated renters left the neighborhood, those who were able to stay benefited from a lot of the changes. So that led the authors to really stress the importance of increasing the supply of affordable housing in those neighborhoods. There are also some other findings that were super surprising and weird, frankly. So if you look it up, I would ask you to remember that most of the findings described in terms of the relationship between gentrification and displacement and benefits and harms are described for, all of the cities that they analyzed in the aggregate. And the dynamics in Seattle may or may not have been different.
Diana, we have a few questions in the chat. I'm wondering if we're going to, if we can have them at the end so we can let you finish this section and then
okay.
Just a little bit.
Okay, that would be great. And I will power through here.
Great.
So this is a quote from that study that I was talking about from Miriam Zook. And she notes that none of the studies that she looked at in her literature review really attempted to analyze the loss of social meaning, cultural practices, and social networks associated with gentrifying neighborhoods, because those things are super difficult to quantify. So I'm going to talk really briefly now about some of the ways that the city uses ACS and census data to better understand neighborhoods and displacement in Seattle and to inform city programs and policies. So I'm going to talk about just two of these: the Displacement Risk Index and MAP, and the Equitable Development Monitoring Program.
And Diana, thank you. This is a great clarification. So these are tools that we have and people can go and access, right? We have
that is correct, and we'll include links with these slides, so you'll see where you can click on these and go directly to the tools. So the Displacement Risk Index, which you see pictured here, identifies places where there's a high risk that vulnerable residents could be displaced from their home due to development pressures. This was developed in 2016 as part of the city's growth and equity analysis to guide the long-term growth strategy in Seattle's comprehensive plan and to inform the city's anti-displacement efforts and investments. And the Office of Planning and Community Development will be updating this index and will be including 2020 census when it's available shortly here. And again, this index will inform the next comprehensive plan update, which is due in 2014. Just wanted to highlight that the vulnerability indicators that went into the displacement risk index are all from the ACS or decennial census. Another tool that we have to complement the displacement risk index that you just saw is our dashboard of heightened displacement risk indicators. These are listed here and are designed to provide timely insights into who is most affected by displacement and where these pressures are currently concentrated or getting worse. So it's more of a short-term kind of tool. Two of these indicators are based on ACS data, and there are a number of other indicators that we're working on. The ones that we're working on are over to the right. So, for example, including eviction filings. And I also just want to put a plug in for checking out the findings from the Puget Sound Regional Council on reasons why people move. This is one of the few surveys that I've seen that actually asks detailed questions about that. And it was done right here in our region. So you can link on that. Here is an example of one of the charts from our heightened displacement risk indicators. It's showing trends by income level in the share of renter households who are paying more than 50% of their income on housing costs. And with this, I just want to point out how the share of very low income households, those are the ones in the sort of dark orange, the percentage of them who are severely cost burdened shot up over the last decade. And of course, the extremely low income households are the renters who are still the most likely to be severely cost burdened. And all of this is before the pandemic struck. Our dashboard actually covers 3 different types of displacement risks. So each of the indicators that we have on there is related to at least one of these types of displacement. Direct or physical displacement, like evictions or foreclosures. Indirect or economic displacement, such as when households find they have to move because of increasing housing costs or loss of cultural networks. And then also something that we call exclusionary neighborhood change, which is really similar to gentrification. And the idea there is that households are unable to move in to an area that they otherwise, like before, would have been able to move into due to increased housing costs. These are all of the components of our Equitable Development Monitoring Program. In addition to the heightened displacement risk indicators, we also have community indicators, looking at housing, community livability, transportation, and economic opportunity. And we have a website on neighborhood change, and that includes the maps that you saw at the very beginning of my talk. So we launched this reporting just recently in the fall of 2020, and we selected those measures in the Equitable Development Monitoring Program with community engagement, with consulting with folks in other departments, other agencies, with university researchers. We contracted with the UC Berkeley's Urban Displacement Project, actually with Miriam Zook and her colleagues, for recommendations on the heightened displacement risk indicators. Importantly, we also got advice from the Planning Commission and the Equitable Development Initiative Advisory Board, and we did quite a bit of engagement with community members as well. So that's my end of my presentation.
Thank you, Diana. I know there's a lot of questions about also links that people would like to go and try these tools. Maybe while we do the next session, we can share some in the chat. I want to move on to our next presenter, and I know there were many questions there regarding whether the maps included unhoused communities, where were the connections between racial and historic reasons for displacement in the city of Seattle. There were also a question about voucher programs and how grouping people together on income class was one of the reasons why displacement was happening. I want to make sure that I am at least addressing them so the presenters can maybe address that. And if it's not there, we will make sure to get back to those at the end. So I am very excited to introduce you to our great colleague, Uba Gardheere, who is going to be talking to us from her place as an Equitable Development Division Director. And she will be talking to us about what is this Equitable Development Initiative and what is the framework. And let's please welcome our fantastic colleague whose biography I almost couldn't even fit there, and I had to chop a bunch of stuff, and I feel bad for it, but I do want to say that she is a great mom who has the greatest, cutest kids who are now taller than her. Unbelievable. Anyhow, welcome, Uba. I appreciate you taking the time, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Elsa, and thank you, Diana. I learned stuff. I just put my, and actually Diana also, thank you for helping me with the presentation. So I will talk about the EDI. As you know, the monitoring program came from the community asking for us to measure the equitable development, both the heightened displacement and equitable development outcomes. The EDI framework has the dual goal to achieve racial and social equity in understanding that we need strong communities and strong people. And this means community stability and resilience in the face of displacement pressure, as well as, you know, we really need to have great neighborhoods throughout the city that is accessible for all. And as the data shows, that is not the case right now. We understand that growth that achieves these goals require more public investments above the current levels, and specifically into these equity drivers that you see right now on your screen. The first equity driver is promoting economic opportunities for marginalized populations and enhancing community anchors, providing access to quality education, training, and living wage jobs. And it's really important to understand that each equity driver has its outcome associated with it. And some of that we have addressed it with the data that the OPCD data team, including Diana, Nick Welch, and other folks from the team have been able to pull together. The next equity driver is around enacting policy programs and investments that allow marginalized populations, businesses, and community organizations the ability to stay in their communities. So it's just not only about residential displacement, which a lot of the data speaks to that, but also like looking holistically at other types of displacement, including business and community organizations. The third one is around, you know, respecting local community character, the cultural diversity and values, and honestly looking at EDI from an asset-based approach and supporting and strengthening cultural communities. And one of the key areas of EDI is to making sure that we are building on the local cultural assets of in Seattle's most marginalized BIPOC communities. The fourth equity is around, you know, in prioritizing investments in an effective and affordable way in transportation that honestly supports transit-dependent communities and ensuring that, you know, we're not focusing our transportation in, you know, areas that, you know, leads to, like, for example, tourists coming from the airport and going to downtown Seattle and things like that. But how do we make sure that as we are looking at investments in transportations, that everybody, you know, has access to affordable transportation all over, like during the day, the weekends and things like that. EDI's goal is to change the way Seattle grows, the way Seattle invests in communities, and building through integrated cross-sector, community-driven approaches that benefit low-income people and communities of color across Seattle. And our work is in partnership, and we co-design with those communities. For the last 5 years now, we have had advisory board that has helped us come with, what kind of policies do we need to place in place, what kind of investments and how that investment is allocated and the criteria and all that. And I've seen some of the advisory board members on this call, so feel free to add to it and answer some of those questions. Next. Yeah, and Diana talked about the displacement and access to opportunity risk in MAP, and I just wanted to put this here because this is the framework and the map that we use in EDI to make our investments. We focus on the areas that are in high risk displacement and mostly low access to opportunity, with some, and differences. Like, for example, we know that the Native American community, the indigenous community, are not in any of this map. They didn't have any of their neighborhoods because they were displaced from all over Seattle. So we make sure that when we're looking at our investments and things like that, we have other additional considerations that we're looking at, and focus on areas that have low access to opportunity, mostly the south of the Sheep Canal, but have some, areas that we focus on. For example, Chinatown ID and Central District shows up as a high risk, as a high access to opportunity neighborhood, but we also know that the communities that we're focusing on are not the ones who are benefiting from that opportunity. So we make sure that we are looking at that. Next. So I think it's really important for us to really lead our work from like a values-based place. And we are doing this work and have accountability through measurement, because we have seen how, there was really great questions in the chat about how racialized is this displacement geographically, and, and things like that. And the map I showed, if you overlay that map with the redlining map from 1930, it's the same neighborhoods that have been displaced, that are being displaced right now or have low access to opportunity, that the neighborhoods that have suffered from widespread disinvestment, had racialized policies like redlining and restrictive covenants and things like that. So we are working to undo a lot of that. And, as you know, in the central area, and Blacks went from being close to 60% of the population in 1990 to less than a quarter of the population more recently, as 2010 actually census is concerned. So it'll be really interesting to see what the census for 2020 shows as far as, the population of in African Americans and Blacks in Central District. Next. Yeah, so the Equitable Development Monitoring Program, again, as I said, it was born out of an inside-outside strategy of community and city folks. And it comes from a Council Resolution 31577, which calls for a stronger integration of racial and social equity in the comprehensive plan, and also making sure that we establish an Equitable Development Initiative, which comes with an implementation plan, a financial strategy plan, and right now a funding associated with it that we have been working with the communities most impacted. It's also part of the city's comprehensive plan and the Equitable Development Implementation Plan, like I say, which both identify monitoring of indicators as a key for making progress in advancing equitable development. And I also want to say that there is also this recognition in the Equitable Development Monitoring Program, and understanding that the folks who are impacted by this have the most kind of solutions and ways to really solve this. So I think Diana earlier mentioned some of the things that we probably need to change as we move forward is how do we come up with a participatory research component. That's what the EDI advisory board and other folks have been asking for. And how do we as a city folks transform the usual punitive data culture and come up with a transparent, non-punitive culture around data analysis and use? How do we hold a practice that doesn't prove or blame communities for institutional and systems failure? So those are some of the things that we're looking at. Next. And, like I said, EDI is a part of the systemic change needed to eliminate racial inequities, and the policies, programs, investments, and everything that we're pulling together in paper supposed to lead to racial equity outcomes. Whether or not we have been getting there either for the last 5 years or the last 10 years, that still is a big question. And but I think the understanding that monitoring is a fundamental way of ensuring accountability and making meaningful and sustainable progress on equitable development that came up from the EDI implementation plan. Next. So we are required on the Equitable Development Implementation Plan to work both with the Equitable Development Initiative Advisory Board and the Seattle Planning Commission, and have an ongoing roles. They have an ongoing roles of advising on these indicators and using the findings. Diana has closely worked with the Planning Commission, with the Advisory Board, and has consistently came back to them to really like show them what we're coming up with. How are we like even framing the report and things like that, and didn't just leave it at that, but also had a strong partnership with Department of Neighborhoods to really have a very robust community engagement process as we were continuing to pull together this report. And as I said earlier, one of the key improvements that we want to make sure we do is integrating a community-based participatory research in this process. Next. So how is the city using displacement risk and the equitable development monitoring program? One, I've already talked about how the EDI investment happens, and that's like prioritizing the neighborhoods that showed up in those maps as high-risk displacement neighborhoods. And then also in just really focusing most of our investments in, for example, we get a lot of applications from Rainier Valley and Southeast Seattle. And a lot of times the directions that we give our review committee is, I think, yeah, give us the recommendations, but make sure that you have a balance of the projects that we are going to support as far as geographically, because at the end of the day, once we get the recommendation, we have to like socialize it, and it has to be approved by 4 other directors from the city, including the Office of Housing, the Budget Office, Economic Development, and all that. But also really, as they give us these recommendations, if we have a lot of like our funding, for example, going to Rainier Valley, using the data to make the case of why that, right? So for example, we haven't been able to fund a lot of projects from North Seattle, and one reason for that is we don't get a lot of applications from there because the communities that we work with in those neighborhoods are just starting to organize, and they're in the area of things that we call, we normally have a balance of shovel ready and shovel hungry projects. So they're in a place where right now they're just shovel hungry, and that just means that just building their capacity. And capacity building funds are not as big as capital funds. For us, EDI just closed the 2021 funding round, which when we advertised the RFP, we had $6.8 million for organizations. But now that we're in the middle of making decisions, we have an additional $3 million that was left from our acquisition funds. And the review committees just started meeting to make the decisions for these funds. And we have gotten more applications than we ever got in the last few years, actually more than double. And like I said, we have about $9.8 million, and the asks is over $46 million. So we'll be probably saying no to over 85% of the applicants. And these funds, again, will be used to fund capacity building, property acquisition, and project development. There's another one-time funding that we're working with OED, DON, Office of Housing and things like that. That's called the Strategic Land Investment Fund, which was a $30 million one time. That also the applications for that closed right now. That $30 million, we got 100 applications. We're going to be funding less than 10. And folks are asking for over $300 million. So the need is huge, but we are working on ensuring that we get to at least fund some of these groups and build their capacity around property acquisitions and things like that. Next. And then the other way that organizations are using the data is, first of all, they actually use it to make the case for and getting funded and things like that. I see it at other funding tables, and I've seen organizations like, for example, Africa Town Land Trust, or Friends of Little Saigon, or even United Indians of all tribes, using the data that and we just pulled together to make the case for getting funded and things like that. They also use it to really, our funding is project-based, but really look at the neighborhood level needs and use the data to make the case and things like that. Next. Another way that the city is using the data is, as you all know, and the city also released $30 million in funding. That's part of a $100 million investment to Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. And the city used this data to make determination of not only what kind of program projects that they're going to fund, but how the funding is going to be allocated. But I just want to stop right here and put Diana or Nick on the spot. And since they've been part of this, how the city is using this data, they've been part of that conversation to see if they have anything to add to this slide. If not, we will continue. So I want to say that part of the $100 million, there's this $30 million that went to departments like early learning, departments like Office of Housing, and HSD and things like that to cover the food sovereignty and things like that. There's the $30 million around the Strategic Land Investment Fund. That yes, we will have a table that right now we are making decisions and have a committee making those decisions. And then there's another $30 million that's going to go through a participatory budgeting that Office of Civil Rights is going to oversee. And finally, the $10 million, I think the decisions of that have already been made through the Human Services Division. Next. Of course, we use this data to inform our anti-displacement strategies. This data helped us to figure out how our, investments and was allocated, especially for EDI. Last year when COVID hit, we normally have an RFP process that's focuses on capacity building and project development. But last year, after talking to the community and things like that, they needed a quick kind of like capacity building of about $50,000 or so, or $50,000 to $75,000 to meet the needs that they were really dealing with at the time. And it was really, this $50,000 was more of like, just continue doing the awesome work that you're doing. And we funded over 60 organizations like that. Other ways the city is using is updating the comprehensive plan by scoping and issues identification and updating the Sierra's growth strategy, which I'm looking forward to seeing that new update. And no pressure, Nick, but yeah, so those are the other ways that the city is using this data. Next. Before Stephanie, you introduced Stephanie, I think one of the other things that I just quickly wanted to add on this monitoring program that we've been hearing from the advisory board and other leaders in the community is how can the city use this data consistently to inform a practice to improve our anti-displacement strategies and also prevent harm. How do we identify potential solution with an eye to the root causes so that they will be more likely for the community and for us as inside disruptors to disrupt and shift the racially disproportionate outcomes that we are seeing in our city. And then finally, one of the other things that we keep hearing from the advisory board is how can we use this data to foster an authentic, build trusting relationships so that sometimes we see that the data will go in a scary directions. How do we make sure that we are collectively partnering with community to seek solutions together rather than blame each other? And this involves considering how current policies and ways of doing work maintain or reinforce structural and institutional racism. So we had some questions come up in the chat, but these are the same questions and advice that we are getting from the advisory board. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Uba. We could talk about these topics for a long time, and one of the reasons of creating this space is exactly to at least show folks where can they get access to these tools and continue the conversation in different spaces. There will be follow-ups on the links and everything that we've talked about and how to keep connecting. And if there's people want to learn more about the ADI, the advisory board, or different spaces, we will make sure to send that. So thank you, Uba. And with that, I just want to remind everybody we're talking about data and how can we identify and address monitor displacement and how is the city also addressing it. And for that, we also have two other powerful women from the Office of Housing of the City of Seattle who will be talking to us first about what is the Office of Housing and then what are the programs and some examples that we have on how we are addressing displacement and using data to address this gigantic issue. So with that, I want to welcome Stephanie Velasco, who is the Communications and External Relations Manager for the Office of Housing. And please let me welcome you and welcome to the space. So that's Stephanie.
Sure, and I'm happy to go ahead and start the presentation, and then Jessica, my colleague, will also be jumping in at the end, so maybe she can get her introduction then after this. We could do it now. Let's, either way.
There you, why don't you introduce her after you speak?
I'd be happy to. I'd be happy to.
Go for it.
So Jessica Sanclemente Gomez works at the Office of Housing. She is a strategic advisor on that policy and equitable development team. She's also just an amazing community organizer. I know that that's kind of where she's coming from in terms of her background. It's where I'm coming from in terms of my background. I know Uba as well. And so I say that up front because I really appreciate what Uba said is the data that we have access to and that we will be sharing with you is very powerful, but it really means very little without those kinds of genuine relationship buildings that Elsa was really reiterating and that Uba talked about. So I wanted to kind of flash our Office of Housing community organizer credentials so that you know, as we're going to go through this data and as we're talking about programs, we are city government employees, but we also are coming at this really from a place of passion and a place of wanting to work closely with community members. So we're ready for the next slide. How's that for an introduction, Jessica? I'm going to give a quick overview overview of what the Office of Housing does. And as I'm kind of going through each of these buckets of our work, know that a lot of these pieces are informed by data, and we'll be talking a little bit about each of those as we go along. But I'll just start here by saying one of the kind of things that the Office of Housing is probably the best known for is stewarding public funds to create and preserve affordable housing. So the fund source that a lot of people are maybe most familiar with is the Seattle Housing Levy. That's a voter-approved levy. So those funds are one of the funds that we steward. Also, the Mandatory Housing Affordability Program creates payment amounts, funds that then go through our office to be invested in affordable housing. So that's one piece of what we do. Another piece is, like I said, we implement the MHA, or Mandatory Housing Affordability Program, and other citywide programs that also kind of try to capture the profits or wealth that is created from new development and try to direct that to affordable housing. Next slide, please, Diana. And then the two other buckets that I want to talk about are one, part of our office works with directly providing services to low-income homeowners to make sure that they can stay in their homes. So when we're talking about displacement, a lot of times we're talking about people who maybe already own their homes. They've owned their homes for a long time, but they are seeing the cost of owning their homes continue to rise. Maybe there's a lot of repair costs that they can't quite keep up with. So in order to make sure that low-income homeowners are able to stay in the neighborhoods that they have already lived in and are able to keep the homes that they own, we offer low-cost and no-cost services to help them repair their homes, make them healthy again. Another thing that we're talking about this summer especially is doing improvements that can help provide heat pumps that also do air conditioning so that people are safe in their homes during heat waves. So those kinds of improvements to help combat displacement. And then the last thing, and this is a piece that Jessica works on directly, is developing policies that support equitable development throughout the city. So I'll leave that a little bit for Jessica to talk about with an example in South Park. But that is, in a nutshell, what we do. Next slide, please. And just if you haven't seen, or maybe you didn't realize as you're going about the city, now that we're actually more people are getting out of their houses and getting to go around the city, these are some of just a few of the many examples of affordable housing developments that the Office of Housing has provided funding for over our 30-year history. So both affordable rental housing, and we'll talk in just a moment about what we mean by affordable, and then also affordable, permanently affordable for sale homes, so home ownership. That is typically first-time home buyers who wouldn't otherwise be able to afford market rate homes. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this is the chart. This is what we mean when we talk about affordable housing. I know that this is a question we often get from community members. What do we mean by affordable? Affordable to whom? And so for the purposes of our presentation and for the purposes of when we talk about the Office of Housing and what we fund, affordable housing means rental or for sale housing that is only available to households that meet certain income eligibility requirements. So we talk about income or rent restricted housing. So the way to read this table, and I'm just gonna go through this briefly, I'm happy to answer questions afterwards. But on the left side of the table, the income level column, you see some percentages there. And what those percentages are saying is percent of area median income. And we use that just because that is nationally a common measure for determining kind of different affordability levels. But as you go across to the right across this table, you can see based on household size, let's take 80% area median income as an example, so the very bottom row. If you have a household of one person, 80% of area median income is about $64,000, $65,000 in terms of 1 year income. For a 4-person household, that's about $92,000, $93,000. And those incomes then are associated with rents or for sale prices. So for the Office of Housing, a lot of our housing is actually affordable to people making 60% area median income. So the second from the bottom row. So looking at a 1-bedroom rent might be about $1,300 or a 2-bedroom about $1,500 a month. Again, happy to talk through this. I know that's a lot of information, but let's go ahead and go to the next slide. We go one more. Yep, there we go. Thank you. So I'm going to put a couple links in the chat. In terms of data that we, the Office of Housing, produce, we have annual reports that say, here is how we invested the taxpayer dollars that come from the Seattle Housing Levy and mandatory housing affordability dollars that come from the MHA program. Here is how we've invested all of these funds into affordable housing. And so that's what the links that I shared, and these are just captures of those reports. One thing I did want to point out, and we've seen, I think, already twice or maybe 3 times in this presentation, was the fantastic maps that Diana shared first, I think, around displacement risk index. And I shared a link to, we have that map as well in our annual report, where we show each of the investments that we've made every year kind of overlaid on that map. The one that you see up here is actually an example, or is the map that we produced last year for transit access. So all of these kind of different mapping exercises is an illustration of the ways that we take in the data that's produced from the Office of Planning and Community Development with Diana's team, with Uba's team, and take that into consideration as we are prioritizing investments of the funds that I mentioned earlier. So we take into account displacement risk, we take into account transit, we take into account sort of access to opportunity, and all of these other factors as we're determining where to invest in the city. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Jessica to talk a little bit more about some of the policies, as well as kind of an example of the investments that we make in South Park.
Sure. Thanks so much, Stephanie. Thanks, Elsa, for inviting me, and Diana. So I kind of want to take this moment. I didn't put a lot on this slide, so that way we could feel through community preference. I think there's a lot going on here. There might be some assumptions about what the policy does, but also to really set expectations, as usually I tell folks, and I think Evelyn Allen is with us, and she knows the first thing I say is, it's not a silver bullet. It's not here to completely be a right of return. And I want to say that with really open to having a lot of discussion around it if folks want to. So to the left, I'll give you what the data perspective and how we dove into this. And then we'll talk about what the preference, the basics of the preference is. And wearing my hat as, like what Stephanie said, as an organizer, I feel like there's a lot of conversation that can be had. And then as a policy person with the Office of Housing, we can go into like what that fine dance is going to be about how do you make this happen with fair housing, trying to walk that fine line. So to the left is the high risk of displacement map, and you can see the red areas on that map. The executive order coming out of the mayor's office originally to allow for community preference really said that the policy is specifically for high risk of displacement areas. This map is that snapshot from 2016, as you already heard. And those red areas are the high risk of displacement. So now this executive order really set the tone for what we were were looking, what census tracts we were looking for. And we knew that there was a history, this look back, that really told us about displacement that had already occurred. And that is the data that we dove into with my colleague Bing Jun from the Office of Housing as well. And we just had all these questions, what it looked like in 1990, 1980, 2000s, 2010, to really say, what was that story? So we included a couple of data indicators, and I'm not going to go into, what said what, how, and when. We do have all the backup to say that there were these other areas that are not highlighted in red in 2016, but that really made the case for large, and I'm not going to call it displacement, but large movements and large change within those census data. And just to caveat that is that the data from every census throughout the last several decades is changed. So the normalization of that data also was not so easy. So what we did was looking at race, education, and English proficiency and income, really allowing to look at change throughout time with those major 4 indicators. And so we were able to pick up, for example, the Central District, which is not highlighted in red on the left map. So that is how we were able to use data to say, well, let's think about this historically. What is our plan here? And what is our goal when we're thinking about all the areas and thinking about diversity and fair housing and giving folks access to come back, an opportunity to come back to their neighborhoods. So this is how we landed to the map on the right. It's on our website. All the census tracts in green are basically allowed to have a community preference. All this to say, I'm going to put this out there that if you are interested in putting a community preference in your building that is not in a census tract that's green, but you want to make a case for it, please call me. And not to say that I'm giving the green light, but I think that this is an opportunity to have a really good conversation with mission-based organizations that are looking to implement a community preference. Next slide. So the community, how does it work? So this is, I just talked about the designated census tracts. It's a permissive policy. That means it's not mandatory. It is not citywide, obviously. But this is if and who wants it. Applies with a template that we have on our website. You fill it out and then you submit it back to us. We do look for conversations about why do you want to do it? Who do you plan, what kind of preference policy, what kind of preferences do you want to put into that building? And also, and to kind of go into this a little bit more, is that you are creating, for every developer, you are creating your policy. You're not taking a policy that the Office of Housing does and is 100% prescribing it. So what we do is that we give you a basic guideline, which is on our website, and it gives you the ins and outs of like how to implement it. You submit your template to the Office of Housing, give us how you would like for it to work, how will you do your lease up, how many of the units, what is the description of the units, and what communities you want to target. This to say that this is not an affirmative marketing plan. So an affirmative marketing plan can be very race specific as to how you promote your building, with it not being exclusively to a particular community. So talking about who you're translating it to, what the flyer might look like. But when you're moving into community preference, it does need to be race neutral. So this description of your policy that you'll be implementing into your building will need to be race neutral. Your affirmative marketing can be targeted. So just to link those two up. Up to 50% of the apartments, the units in the building can have a community preference. So developers can choose 10%, 20%, or 50%. We don't recommend going over 50 because we have received kind of an indication from HUD that that is not looked well upon, and that could be up for litigation. And when we say that we recommend, keep in mind that we are not approving a policy. What you're doing is that you're sending us the information of a policy that we have had lots of legal advice about, and that's why our guideline is the way it's written. And essentially, we are saying that you should check in with your own legal counsel to verify and feel comfortable about what you're how you're going to be administering your community preference. The preferences are that we're recommending, and we got legal, like kind of a not approval, but kind of like the green light to say that these are pretty safe, is that an applicant is a current resident of that census tract, or if you want to expand that census tract, the current residents within several of the surrounding census tracts. The applicant is a family member or ancestor, is a former resident, so it is that displacement of you're coming back to the neighborhood, or the applicant uses the applicant uses the services in the neighborhood. Child is enrolled in the local school, medical services, faith-based organization, food pantry, whatever activity in the neighborhood is bringing you back or want you to live closer to that. These are the preferences that we suggest and recommend in our guideline. However, you can expand on it. You can use one. You can use the ranked way of saying, well, if you're a tenant who is applying to be part of the building and you hit 2 of these, then you ranked higher than somebody who only has one, meets one of those criteria. So it's a number way for a developer to kind of really come up with a policy that makes sense for them, and also their capacity to be able to lease up tenants that are coming in with a community preference. We do have our legal counsel at the City of Seattle review policies that are being put out by the developer. And then just to say that this is something that we feel that we have high approval from legal counsel in the City of Seattle and outside, and think that this is really that beautiful dance that we can play with fair housing, making sure that we're not crossing the line and that we are thinking about diverse, inclusive neighborhoods. Next slide. So wonderful. It kind of just to change it up a little bit. However, community preference is part of the values that are coming out in this future project in South Park. The Duwamish Valley program is this wonderful program that's in connection with the Office of Planning and Community Development, along with the Office of Sustainability and Environment, working to look at all long-term, midterm, and long-term strategies in fighting displacement and health risks in the Duwamish Valley. With that, our goals that were set out in the Duwamish Valley action plan that was published in 2018 really set out what the Office of Housing was going to do as far as within the Duwamish Valley. And that was a lot of the programs that for single family homeowners in the safe homes, the healthy homes program that Stephanie was talking about, but also thinking about multifamily buildings. What is our potential to really build in the neighborhood, to think about anti-displacement measures and securing safe but affordable housing for a long term. So we are in the process of acquiring 2 sites in South Park, in the heart of South Park, on 14th and Henderson. And that is the first time the Office of Housing has moved onto the market and has taken property out of the speculative market for the point of affordable housing, for the end goal. And a lot of folks that are here are partners thinking about their development in affordable housing. That's usually how we do work. We partner up with an affordable housing developer. They have acquired land, or they're thinking or want to acquire land, and they come in to us, ask for subsidies, and then we work on the transaction with them. But we are not lead. We are the gap funder. So we're coming in, just as Stephanie said, and what we do, we're kind of coming in as a partner on this, but we're not leading or project managing this transaction. At the end, we'll give you the restrictions to make sure that you're holding on to that affordable housing for 50+ years with our regulatory agreement, but we're not the front runner, like we're not the mover. And so what we're doing is that we are in the movement of acquiring these 2 parcels of land that will be an assemblage to hopefully make about 100 units of affordable housing. And like I said, I think it's setting really great precedents to think that the City of Seattle is participating in this, will acquire the land, and then put it out for the request for proposals for great, innovative, creative ways for an affordable housing development in that community. And this is all in partnership with the Duwamish Valley Affordable Housing Coalition, who's done some amazing organizing and advocacy, as well as the Duwamish Valley River Cleanup Coalition. Next slide. And so this is what it looks like. And I'm not giving too much detail here, but I feel like you all probably have seen this or driven by it. And these two parcels allow for about 100 units of family-sized housing. So this is not single, just studios and one bedrooms. This will likely be 1, 2s, and 3s. That is right in the heart of where there might be a beautiful corridor in development of like more action, more walkability, more retail space. And this is all to say is that when we're thinking about a transaction, I think everybody here could probably know what I mean, is that we're thinking about what is strategic and what pencils. And this is a great opportunity for us to think about, how do people pencil into a transaction? How do we think about what community says, what they want? How do those values really rank? This is the beauty that I feel that this is my work with community and what they wanted. And what is it that you were looking for? And what did you want a development to, what would you want a development to really kind of hone in on? Next slide. So these are the basics, very general details. We have not closed on these two properties yet. We hope to close soon. So this is a work in progress. 70 to 120, which large range here. Family-sized units for low-income families, community services on the ground floor, activation of the 14th Avenue South with ground floor uses, aim to work really closely with the Office of Sustainability and Environment for a highly energy efficient building. Community preference will be used and will be put into our request for proposals when developers are interested to apply. And it meets the racial equity outcomes of the Duwamish Valley Action Plan. If you haven't checked out the plan, I definitely recommend it. Next slide. And how does this all work? So this is just a snapshot of some of the policy initiatives that my team at OH is working on. But what this does mean is that the Office of Housing works on anti-displacement. We are part of a large conversation internally, externally with community, as well as with an interdepartmental team with all different agencies. It's about 9 or 10 agencies that are coming together, having collaborative conversations about, what are you working on? What am I working on? Is there synergy? Can we really come together and maybe expand on something and really try to find that political will within everybody? 1, to not work in silos, and then 2, to come together and say, well, there is this like little inch of synergy here. Can we expand on that? Or maybe this is what I've already done. Can you expand on your end because this has worked, or lessons learned? So there are brainstorming sessions. There's a lot of opportunity here about what this team will do in the future, and really allow for North Star ideas. So what are we dreaming about? How can we think outside the box? What, at some point, folks really thought that purchasing property in South Park and that the city would actually sign a purchase and sale agreement was completely not going to happen. I think with a lot of work with community, a lot of beautiful relationships that I've built with the city, is really having an opportunity to, how can we make people pencil, and how is that voice penciling in? And I'm saying pencil because I'm thinking of like affordable housing developments and through pro forma. How does this work out into our budget line of how community is brought into the conversation? How do we bring obviously data and what we're dealing with as sometimes technocrats, and really coming into marrying those two? And I think that the Office of Housing has always wanted to, and I think South Park is a wonderful example of how we've done that. And then just to pivot back for a second to the community preference. Community preference had a long history of community organizing and advocacy that the city was then supporting. It wasn't that the city had the idea by itself. And on our website, we do have a little bit of that history of, say, how the city eventually came out with its executive order, but it came through long history of folks in the city and community advocates really pushing for a preference plan I'm originally from New York City. Their community preference is over 50 years old. Of course, there are issues with all of this. We do not want litigation, but we're also saying as a city of Seattle that we think this is great, but we also aren't necessarily always afraid of litigation, that we're willing to kind of go up to bat for it. So I appreciate that. I appreciate all my colleagues on this. I think there is wonderful opportunities to really think where we can go as a larger city family, thinking about anti-displacement. I know with South Park, we are thinking about what is that big investments that will coming in from the city that will probably put pressure on renters and tenants and maybe push out folks. How do we mitigate that as these investments and as these wonderful programs are being developed to really counter the push that tenants might feel? So that's it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Jessica. And I know you're on vacation, so a bigger even thank you for being here. I know there's a few questions on the chat. I'm hoping that you guys have been following. There is the question of unhoused population and what is everyone doing? What is the role in any of the programs? I just want to throw it in for all of the panelists to talk a little bit about this. Is there data? Where can we find it? And what are the programs related to affordable housing displacement? If anybody can answer from the chat, that would be great.
I can answer here, or maybe other folks would.
Go ahead.
There is a point in time count that happens every year. That's really the main source of data that we have on folks who are unhoused. I will grab a link. I'm not very good at talking and finding a link at the same time, but I'll put it in there in just a moment. So that's where we typically find the data. I see from Amanda that the point of time was canceled this past year. I believe that was due to COVID reasons. It still is the sort of best way that we have to take those benchmarks every year. So if there are other folks here, this is a little bit outside of the Office of Housing's wheelhouse. Typically, we work closely with the Human Services Department to track data related to folks who are unhoused. But if there's anyone here who has a suggestion for other sources of data, open to hearing that as well. But I will put that link in.
Thank you. And I know Diana, this has come up at different times, and I think it's going to be it specific. We are going to have to do one specific topic on this to make sure that we're addressing it. That's what I'm taking from every time we've had this conversation.
Right, and we have actually kind of a handout that collects a bunch of the questions that we've gotten about, what the census covers, what the ACS covers and doesn't cover. So we've got some information in there. Then we can refresh that sheet and send it out to folks.
Thank you. There's another question, and I think this is from for Jessica and Stephanie about about the programs. Do services in neighborhood include places of work in the neighborhood? And also, do you know who the developer? Oh, I think you answered that one, or the developer for South Park, and if it's an RFQ or RFP. There's a couple more questions about whether I would imagine the point scoring for the big resource from tax credits might be a challenge for South Park location. Can you address those questions from Robin? Thank you for.
Sure. So the services does not specifically include places of work. This will be a conversation that we'll have with the developer if they think that that is the need. Services is going to be broad. And so that is really a conversation that we'll have with the developer of how they want to kind of characterize it, or who they will do any outreach to. So when we talk about services, it's not that we're going to be asking which services, but if you specifically will choose a service, we will likely move away from that and ask you to expand that, because services can mean a lot of things. Services can be very specific to the point when somebody can litigate about a discriminatory service. Like you're picking a service that is only for members of this organization or only members of that faith-based of that church. So it allows for us to have a conversation with the developer at that point and talk about expanding that a little bit. The developer for South Park, this has not at all been researched or done in any way. We are not going to be doing it until we have an engagement process with the community. We're going to be looking at what exactly are the housing needs. And then there will be a development for an RFP at that point. We want to do an RFP because we also, just to get funding from the city of Seattle for the Office of Housing, you'll have to meet certain requirements, and that will be for developers who have previous experience. So you're almost catching an RFQ at the same time. But for the proposal, we do think that there could be a lot of flexibility, or if not, a lot of creativity coming out from developers, depending on who their maybe their mission kind of says, like what they do or their services that they provide, or their relationship to already community-based organizations in South Park. So that's that. And then the last thing is about the tax credits. This is kind of something that really is about all the community-based kind of applications that we'll get from our NOFA round at the Office of Housing. And this will be a conversation that our lending team will have about any particular challenge that they might have, but this is not new to any of the projects that come in the door for OH.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments that you may want to say? As you know, the way that we lined up the conversation was to share those tools. We encouraged and invited everyone to visit them, use them. And what I heard from all my colleagues is that, and what we know is that data should legitimize our experience as community and should reflect on the experience that we are living, so we can use it to work and to put it to work and advocate for the work the community wants us as city employees, but also from community. What I heard from our colleagues at the city is that we need community to come and use this data and also help us advocate for what they want. So I am going to be very on time for this session and thank everybody for joining us, for using your lunch time. We had a great attendance. And one of the things that I wanted to do, but I want to respect folks, were to say, if you want to say where you're calling us from, where you're joining, you can put it in the chat. We will have upcoming sessions. Our next one's going to be in August. We're going to be talking about the census data, the release of a new data. We're going to have one on mental health and youth. We're going to be talking about different topics until once a month until December, and we'll hopefully continue in 2022. But I am so thankful for all the speakers today, taking the time, and for all of you for joining us. We'll see you here in our next I Love Census Data. So thank you, everybody. And this is recorded. You will get an email with the recording and the information. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Great. What is it? Tuesday.